This Day in Sports History.
Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
Welcome to another edition of This Day in Sports History, a member of the Sports History Network. You can find more information and more podcasts at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, have you had your fantasy football league draft yet? Now, I would assume that with the first game coming up tonight with the Chiefs hosting the Ravens, that you have. Well, hopefully you've got somebody on your fantasy team that did what Peyton Manning did on this day back in 2013. And just like the Chiefs tonight, Peyton's Denver Broncos opened the NFL season with Baltimore in the NFL kickoff game. This was a rematch of the previous season's divisional playoff game, which, if you remember, was the Mile High Miracle game won by the Ravens after Joe Flacco's 70-yard bomb to Jacoby Jones to force overtime. So, the Broncos were looking to avenge a little bit of that here on opening night of the 2013 season. After going scoreless in the first quarter and the Ravens holding a 7-0 lead, Manning went to work. He threw back-to-back touchdown passes to Julian Thomas, but the Broncos still trailed 17-14 at the half. From there, it was mostly Denver, scoring 28 straight points, all by the arm of Peyton Manning. He connected with Andre Caldwell, twice to Wes Welker, and then hit Demaryius Thomas to make it 42-17 in the fourth. Now, maybe if the Ravens had not scored with 5.5 to play to make it a two-possession game, Manning would have holstered the gun, but instead, with the ball and time, he hit Demaryius Thomas again, this time for a 78-yard TD strike. Manning's stats for the night were nearly off the charts. He completed 27 of 42 passes for 462 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. His 7 touchdown passes tied him for the NFL record for a single game with 5 others at the time. The last to do it prior to him was Joe Kapp back in the 1969 season, 44 years earlier. Now, it's been done twice since, with Nick Foles throwing 7 touchdowns about 2 months later, and then Drew Brees equaled that in 2015. So, if you were in a PPR league and you had Manning as your starter on this night, he racked up an amazing 49.3 points for you. And that's the highest individual game total in the history of fantasy football. And a pretty good night in real-life football. Now, of course, Peyton benefited greatly from what happened on this day back in 1906, when the first legal forward pass was thrown in a football game. And can we all just say, hallelujah? I mean, I don't mind watching a wishbone offense every now and again, or even the occasional 3 yards in a cloud of dust play, but the forward pass was a necessary rules change to make the game more fun to watch, right? But wouldn't you know it, the first legal one was incomplete. On this day, it was St. Louis playing at Carroll College in Waukesha, Wisconsin. St. Louis's Bradbury Robinson put the first pigskin in flight, legally that is, past the line of scrimmage before it fell harmlessly to the dirt. But they weren't done. Even though their first try failed, they tried again later in the ballgame. And this time, Robinson found a willing receiver named Jack Schneider, who reeled in a 20-yard pass for a touchdown. St. Louis went on to win the game 22-0, and they utilized the forward pass to great effectiveness that season, and it sounds like they had a pretty good defense too, because they went undefeated in 1906, and they outscored their opponents 407-11 that year. On this day in 1979, Ann Meyers became the first woman to ever be signed to an NBA contract. The Indiana Pacers signed her to a $50,000 contract and gave her a tryout with the team along with 9 other male players. There were a lot of people who thought this was a publicity stunt, but Meyers had been an All-American at UCLA all 4 years, and she was the most dominant women's player in the nation at the time. she had turned down an offer to play in the newly formed Women's Basketball League because she wanted to keep her amateur status and play in the 1980 Olympic Games. But despite the fact that the boycott of the Moscow Games had not yet been announced and would not be for another 6 months, she saw the chance to play in the NBA along with her brother Dave, who had been a number 2 pick by Milwaukee, as a great opportunity and too good of a one to pass up. So she signed the contract, which made her ineligible for the Olympic team, which of course became a moot point anyway in a few months. Her workouts were impressive. Pacers coach Slick Leonard had not really been a fan of this move by the front office and actually advised her to not do it. He had a bit more of an old-school thought about where women should be, and it wasn't playing basketball with men. But she made it past the first 2 rounds of cuts before she was denied a spot on the team. Ultimately, at 5 feet 9 inches, 145 pounds, she was just a little bit undersized. She did find a place in the organization, though. She was signed to be the color analyst for the Pacers television broadcasts at a time when there were not very many women on television talking sports. She eventually signed on to play with the New York Gems in the WBL until the league folded in 1981. And on this day in 1971, it was the closest ever finish to a Formula One race. This was the Italian Gran Prix held at Monza. On the final lap, there were 5 cars in contention with a shot at taking the checkered flag. British driver Peter Gethin was in 4th as he started his final go-round of the track, and he had one thought: push the motor to the limit, and if it didn't break, he would win. Now, he'd never won a Formula One race before, so it was not a surefire winning tactic that had been tested and proven, but it worked on this day. Now, red line on his race car was 10,500 RPM, and he went well past that to 11.5 before he grabbed his top gear. As the cars crossed the line, Gethin's British Racing Motors machine nicked Sweden's Ronnie Peterson by 1/100th of a second. The top 5 drivers finished a little more than a half second apart. It was Gethin's lone career win, and in fact the only time that he ever stood on the podium at an F1 event. But the 1/100th difference in first and second is still the closest margin of victory in Formula One history. Even though this was his only win, he managed to leave his mark for posterity in another way. His average speed for this race of 150.754 miles per hour was the fastest in Formula One for 32 years, until Michael Schumacher topped it in 2003, while also running at Monza. Time now for today's non-sports Did You Know? In an amazing story of survival, in 2013, a ship sank in the Gulf of Guinea off the coast of Nigeria. 11 men unfortunately perished, but the ship's cook was able to find a tiny 4-foot square pocket of air and stayed there for 3 days in the frigid water. When divers arrived, his oxygen supply was nearly gone. The rescuers were amazed to hear his faint knocking. He was rescued, and he recovered in a decompression chamber. That's it for this episode. However, there was a major event that happened today that affected the world of sports that I did not include. The 1972 Munich Olympic massacre began on this day, and I just didn't know how to include it and then transition to a story about fantasy football. So instead, I just did it as a separate episode, and you can find that short episode below this one in your podcast feed. This and every episode of This Day in Sports History is researched, written, voiced, and produced by me. I'll see you back here tomorrow for another edition of This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history. But as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.